The face of George Washington is almost omnipresent in our society, from Mount Rushmore to our wallets. But this omnipresence has turned Washington the man into Washington the monument, to use the old adage. Joseph Ellis's His Excellency George Washington is a well-written biography that does much to reverse this alchemization of the father of our country. Ellis chronicles Washington's life in all of its stages: the soldier fighting for his Britannic Majesty in the French and Indian War, the young squire after the war expanding his holdings, the newly baptized patriot chosen to lead the colonial forces, the American Cincinnatus retiring his sword only to be brought back into the public sphere to oversee the Constitutional Convention and later the country as its first president under the Constitution, and the man in retirement. Ellis's chief accomplishment is to explain how Washington came to the conclusions that he did, and thus took the actions that he did, exercising the ghost of historical inevitability that comes from hindsight. For example, the matter of American independence. In 1764, Robert Carey, head of the London firm Carey and Company, with whom Washington did most of his business, told Washington that he was in debt to the amount of £1,800, a sum that was going to increase when Carey started collecting the 5% annual interest rate on the principal. Washington asked Carey how it was that the market always seemed to favor him but never Washington. Tobacco prices were always low, but prices for London goods continued to rise. And Washington came to the conclusion that it was the mercantile system itself that was designed to keep men like him on dependence of men like Carey. And in this he was absolutely right. Ellis writes, quote, "All the risks fell on Washington's side of the ledger. All the leverage lay with Carey," unquote. The Stamp Act of 1765 and the refusal of the British government in 1763 to grant the Mississippi Land Company's request, of which Washington was an investor, to a land grant of 2.5 million acres on either side of the Ohio River, but which later gave that grant to a London company in 1772, convinced Washington that he was right. The Intolerable Acts of 1774 showed Washington that there was a conspiracy to deprive Americans of their liberty, while the battles of Lexington and Concord made it clear to his mind that war had come. Ellis also does a very good job of removing unjustified stains from Washington's reputation, such as his administration's treatment of the Indians. Washington's desire was for a coexistent peace between Americans and the Indians, and he worked with Secretary of War Henry Knox and local Indian leaders such as Creek Chief Alexander McGillivray to create sovereign Indian homelands. Americans would pass these homelands on their way to the west, but over the decades the Indians in them would become assimilated as citizens. Washington's reason for this was simple. Quote, "Indians, being the prior occupants, possess the right of the soil. To dispossess them would be a gross violation of the fundamental laws of nature and that distributive justice which is the glory of a nation," unquote. Unfortunately, corrupt deals such as between the Georgia legislature and the Yazoo land companies, the fact that there were no Indian leaders like McGillivray among the Six Nations in the Ohio Territory, and the fact that nothing short of a quote-unquote Chinese wall to keep the settlers out caused the collapse of this dream. Unfortunately, Ellis is only human, and there are some rough patches in his narrative. For example, he seems morbidly afraid to remove any attention from Washington. For example, in his preparation to speak of the Constitutional Convention, Ellis notes correctly that terms which we have used to describe the convention, liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus aristocrat, are inadequate. But instead of explaining why this is so, leaving the reader with an expanded knowledge and understanding of the period, Ellis simply leaves it at that and uses the terms then himself. Ellis also does a very poor job of adequately explaining Washington's religion, except to say on several occasions that he was a weak and uncommitted Christian in the traditional sense. But this does not take into account the facts and evidence that are laid out, for example, in Michael Novak's book, Washington's God, in which one of the pieces of evidence that Novak cites is the 1783 circular letter Washington sent to the governors of the states, in which he asked them to practice, quote, "that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion," unquote. Despite these flaws, however, Ellis's biography lays the groundwork for our taking back of Washington the man from Washington the monument.